Of course, has lost a great deal of buildings throughout its history. That's no surprise given the amount of wars and disaster to strike. For instance, had the peasants not revolted in the 14th century, we'd still have the Savoy Palace, which was described as one of the most grand palaces of its time. However, nobody really knows what it looks like. Otherwise, the Great Fire of London of 1666 destroyed the Bridewell Palace and the Royal Exchange, 14,000 homes, and some of London's old gates. Some great buildings, however, like Nonsuch House, which was a building on London Bridge, survived, but that was destroyed a century later. However, on the subject, Nonsuch Palace in South London was destroyed by a mistress of Charles II to pay for gambling debts. Otherwise, Newgate Prison was rebuilt but later destroyed in the early 20th century. Fleet Prison, which you might have heard of, was destroyed in the mid-18th century, and Crystal Palace was destroyed by a fire in the 1930s. The Blitz destroyed buildings like the Carlton Hotel, and long before there was the London Eye, there was the Great Wheel, which was demolished in 1907. So my very long-winded point is that there have been a lot of buildings in London that have been lost. There were periods of great destruction when London was trying to improve its infrastructure, for instance during the 1960s when it wanted to improve its roads, and in the 1870s when it wanted to build new railway lines. For instance, in the 1870s, that's when Tabard Inn was destroyed, and that inn was mentioned by Chaucer in A Canterbury Tales. I'd like to mention a few buildings that were very nearly built in London, starting with Whitehall Palace. Now, this was in the 17th century, and James I was very eager to approve this new royal residence, which would have encompassed most of Whitehall, Downing Street, and small chunks of St James's Park. It would have dwarfed Buckingham Palace. However, James's successor, Charles I, soon had to deal with a civil war. However, fast forward to the 1960s, and the whole area was under threat of being destroyed. This is because in the modernist era, Leslie Martin had plans of turning the whole area around Houses of Parliament into some streamlined office blocks, essentially very brutalist modern office blocks. But he wasn't the only person who wanted to streamline London. This goes right the way back to just after the Great Fire of London, where Christopher Wren had plans on turning London into a city on a grid system. For bridges, Vauxhall Bridge was nearly a 7-story bridge made out of glass and had shops in there. And Tower Bridge was almost very different as well. It could, according to some of the designs that were put forward, have had a huge arch, or if they listen to F.J. Palmer, look like two huge roundabouts. Plus, Charles Holden also had big plans for Tower Bridge, and he wanted to encase the whole thing in glass. But on Charles Holden, he also had huge plans for Senate House, and he wanted to make it a 300-meter long building. As for tall buildings, in the 1990s, there was the Greenbird Tower that was proposed, and this would have been a 440-meter tall tower in the centre of London. But as for more realistic buildings, well, some that were more likely to have been built, in the 1890s, there were plans for London to have its own Eiffel Tower. They had a competition to see if Britain could design an Eiffel Tower that would be bigger than that in France. And in the early 20th century, the clergy backed building a huge imperial halls and monument tower right next to the Houses of Parliament, and the tower would have been almost twice the size as Big Ben. Going back to the 18th century, John Flaxman wanted to build a 75-meter tall statue of Britannia. And the one I find most interesting, in the 19th century, there were plans on building a huge pyramid to house all the dead in London and free up some land.